I'm going to start by asking our first candidate, Mr. Coleman, to make his introductory remarks.
Thank you to the league, Ms. Ortiz, to my wife, Jordan, to everyone who tailgated beforehand, we salute you. Congress is broken because of special interests, because of career politicians. That's why we're stuck with a politics of division, a lack of civility, and way too much partisanship on both sides. I'm a fourth-generation Marylander. I'm also an Army Ranger. I served in Korea. I served 4 combat tours to Afghanistan. Veterans like me are running across the country to bring a new generation of leadership to Washington, to put country over party, to restore civility, to show up and listen, to run towards problems. We have an incumbent, a skilled doctor turned career politician. Under his watch, the opioids epidemic has spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, he is taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry. Rather than invest in innovative ideas in the Chesapeake Bay, he joins the coal caucus. We have no coal in our district. When I get to Washington, here's what I'm going to do. First, we're going to protect the 54,000 people whose health insurance Dr. Harris has voted to repeal and take away over 70 times. Let's get our veterans, my brothers and sisters in uniform, the care they deserve. Let's protect Social Security and Medicare because our seniors, they've earned it too. Second, let's bring political courage to the opioid fight. And third, I will work with anyone and everyone to bring better broadband, better infrastructure, and better jobs to our district. By showing up and listening, by putting country over party, we can tackle our most pressing problems. Thank you.
Please hold your applause. Let's turn to Ms. Martin.
Thank you. I want to give a special thanks to the League of Women Voters because the work that you do directly reflects the principles that I stand on. You put the power into the hands of the citizens. I made the choice to run for Congress with the goal of restoring the power of government back into the hands of the citizens. We need to refrain from accepting more of the failed actions within Congress. We need to finally say enough is enough and demand that change at the voting booth. My great-grandfather was born and raised in Denton. The Eastern Shore is a part of my ancestral heritage, and I understand the values that it encompasses. I spent my entire adult life working for the betterment of others, and I see no reason now why I should stop doing the task that God has sent for me. I believe that individuals should be sovereign over their own lives, and they should not have to sacrifice their values for the benefits of others. I aim to disrupt the establishment hypocrisy that we continue to endure as citizens of this nation. So I ask all of you to join me on November 6th to finally demand that our congressional leaders and our governing authority changes the practices that they take on and give the power back to us for the country that is ours. Thank you.
Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the League of Women Voters for holding this. I think it's my 6th time here doing this. That's because I'm not a newcomer to the district. I've lived in the district over 30 years. In fact, I work right here. I've worked right here in Easton, down the street in the hospital for the last 9 years, and I look forward to the new hospital soon. I didn't just move into the district from Washington, D.C., and my homestead exemption is actually on my house here. I don't take advantage of a homestead exemption in Washington, D.C. You know, you're going to hear some outrageous things from my opponent today. You already heard one. Hundreds of thousands of dollars from pharmaceutical industry. The good thing is you can actually go and check that. You see, you can go to opensecrets.org, and you can look up how much it is. Now, my opponent says he worked for a bank. He was assistant vice president. He should know numbers better than that. Look up exactly how much it is. See if it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's just not true. And as we go through, I'll tell you where you can do all the fact checking. Honestly, you should fire his fact checker. Look, I know it's rare for someone running for office to actually deliver on the promises they made. But when I ran 8 years ago, I promised to work for more jobs, lower taxes, and to preserve your rights and freedoms. And that's exactly what I've delivered. Our economy is booming. Our unemployment rate is at a 50-year low. Our unemployment rate right here in Talbot County Is it low? 4% now? There's 7.2 million jobs available nationwide, and the Republicans passed the largest tax cut in history, putting $2,500 in the pocket of every working family. Now, my opponent says tear it up and start all over. I don't know why he wants to take $2,500 from working families. I don't get it. I promise to be a leader on issues that are important to the district. And that's why I'm especially proud to have been named a friend of the farmer by the American Farm Bureau Federation and a guardian of small business by the National Federation of Independent Businesses. You see, these groups represent such an important part of our Eastern Shore economy. They know exactly what I've delivered for the first district year after year.
Thank you, candidates. We're going to begin with our first question from the League of Women Voters. The League has 3 questions they'll begin with today, and we're going to turn to Ms. Martin to be the first person to respond on this question, which concerns health care. Many people in this district have no health care coverage or find that the premium increases will soon mean health insurance will be unaffordable. What legislation would you support that would provide health care to those who cannot afford coverage and do not qualify for Medicare or Medicaid?
Thank you. First and foremost, not by chipping away on it, full repeal of the Affordable Care Act, full repeal. It is a redistribution of income. It needs to go. Market innovations have already taken hold when it comes to legislation. We have prepaid plans, group plans that have decreased the cost of health care. And we also have insurance companies that already offered guaranteed renewability. We have 2 major insurers on the Eastern Shore, where one of them, prior to the ACA, offered that guaranteed renewability to its customers. Pre-existing conditions. There were premiums that were offered to patients for pre-existing conditions. There is no reason why we should have a healthcare system that redistributes income from those that make a little bit more than the low income earners. What we need is a program and legislation that allows those low income earners to achieve lower healthcare costs, get rid of state barriers. For example, my aunt, who was prescribed opioids after surgery, decided that she wanted to switch to medical marijuana, and her pain management doctor agreed upon it. Her pain management doctor's in Delaware. She comes to Maryland, they won't accept the licensing because it's from Delaware, even though she has a legal option to acquire medical marijuana. Those are barriers that we need to get rid of to allow our lower income folks to get cheaper and more affordable health care.
Thank you. We'll now turn to Mr. Harris, and I can repeat the question if you like.
No, I've got it. Thank you. We'll just do the soundbite fact check right up front because I know what my opponent's going to say. He's going to say I voted to repeal Obamacare 70 times. No, it's not true. You go to the Congressional Research Service, you can get there, and this is the nonpartisan Congressional Research Organization. Their report, February 7, 2017. 20 of those votes actually were signed into law by President Obama. Okay, so just go read the whole story. The other one is that we didn't have a replacement plan. Yes, we did. It's called HR 1628. This is actually a roll call vote, number 256 in the 115th Congress. Go to house.gov. Y'all can look at it. Y'all can see. But look, with regards to what the people in this district need, they need affordable policies. The bottom line is the Affordable Care Act failed to deliver affordable policies unless you receive a subsidy. And there's a health policy reason why it did that. It's because it didn't create a risk pool large enough. So the people in the individual risk pool actually couldn't share the risk widely enough. The premiums went up, and healthy people stopped buying the insurance. It was cheaper to pay the penalty. So what do you got to do? You got to expand the risk pools. That's what the American Health Care Act did. That's what Governor Hogan did with the legislation. He actually used one of the methods, it's called a reinsurance method, that actually was in the American Health Care Act. They actually incorporated it in the state of Maryland because what it does is it's now spread the risk through the entire health insurance pool by placing a small tax on health insurance policies, allowing the premiums to be lower. But if you have a pre-existing condition, you're still covered, and that is reinsured. Your policy is reinsured through this additional taxation. That works. That was in the American Health Care Act. But we also have to make care affordable. That means we have to have price transparency. Look, the president last week announced he's going to put the list price of drugs in ads. Great idea. Pharmaceutical company doesn't like it. I think it's a great idea. We need price transparency at all levels. We need to make sure in the Medicaid expansion, there's a 10% fraud rate in it. We need to make sure that able-bodied people on Medicaid, I'm not talking about disabled, I'm not talking about elderly, I'm not talking about pregnant women, people with children home. Able-bodied men and women should work, get a job, or train for a job in order to get that benefit.
Thank you. We'll now turn to Mr. Coleman.
Healthcare is the biggest issue of our campaign because it's the biggest issue in our district. Dr. Harris, you're a doctor, sir. You should be a national leader on this issue. There should be a bill with your name on it every year that people from Montana to Maryland know. But you're not that kind of leader. You're the kind of guy who in state Senate voted against screenings for colon cancer. The same guy who in state Senate voted against chlamydia screening for pregnant women. Still the same guy who showed up his first day before you're sworn in Congress, sir, and demanded your own personal health care plan kick in, even though you had run against taking it away from people in our district and have spent the last 8 years trying to take it away since. You're still the same guy who told a female constituent you didn't think most women would mind if they paid more for health insurance. I think most women would mind, and I think most men would mind too. We had a woman in Queen Anne's County knock on our RV tour and tell us a story. For 4 years, she hasn't been able to get an answer or a call or an email responded to from your office, sir. Her daughter has type 1 diabetes, and she can't get pre-existing conditions covered, and you guys won't return her calls and emails. Our district deserves better, so here's what I'm going to do. We are going to protect the 54,000 people whose health insurance you tried to take away. We are going to fight for those with pre-existing conditions. We should have a conversation about Medicare. Why can't Medicare negotiate prescription drug prices like the VA? If you're a small business owner, maybe you should be allowed to opt in to Medicare. There's something called the Ranger Creed, and for Army Rangers, it's sacrosanct. For me, it's just shy of my marriage vows. And there's a line in there, never leave behind a fallen comrade. For you, sir, that's the Hippocratic Oath. Your Ranger Creed is the Hippocratic Oath. You've left behind fallen comrades. If you care about health care, if it's an issue that you care deeply about in our choice, in our district, it's an easy choice. Thank you.
I'm going to ask our next question, which concerns the environment, and begin with Mr. Harris. I do want to remind our candidates, this is not a debate. I'd like to encourage all of our candidates to please make their comments to the audience and keep it in the third person if we can. We'll start with Mr. Harris, and this question concerns the environment. The stated mission of the Environmental Protection Agency is to protect human health and the environment. Do you believe this should be a function of the federal government? If yes, what actions would you support, for example, increasing the power of the agency in its budget, that would help it accomplish its mission? Or explain why you disagree and what you believe the agency's mission should be.
Sure. Thanks, Pam. Little fact check first, audience. I voted to keep women's health care priced the same as men's coverage. It's just not true. That was a story made up by a candidate running against me. Second of all, I support pre-existing coverage. I'm clear on the record. Third of all, here's my insurance card. I'm not insured by the federal government. Now, let's talk about the environment. We've got...
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Pam. Let's talk about the environment. Look, the EPA does good things, and it does things that aren't so good. In this district, farming is important. I hope we all agree. The American Farm Bureau Federation, one of their number one things they were fighting, and I joined in that fight for the past 4 years, is against what's called the Waters of the U.S. rule. And what it does is the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers were defining what a navigable body of water is. Now, to the average person, they go, navigable body of water is pretty simple. You can put a boat in it and a boat floats. Oh, no. That's not what the EPA defined it as. They defined it as a potential drainage ditch on a farm, or they defined it as something that would actually have drainage water in it for only a couple of weeks of the year. Didn't matter how deep it was. Could be a farm drainage pond. The Army Corps and the EPA were going to come in and regulate. That is wrong. I opposed it for 4 years. I voted for that amendment in the appropriations bill for 4 years. And fortunately, it's on hold in most states, but unfortunately not in Maryland. We're one of the 22 states where it's not on hold. Now, are there good things the EPA does? You're darn right there are. One's called the Chesapeake Bay program. This is where I disagree with President Trump. President Trump, in his first budget, zeroes out the program in his budget. Second year, I think he cut it by 80%. He didn't go all the way and zero it out. I fought to keep that funding in. I'm on the Appropriations Committee. I'm the only Republican. I'm the one who has a say with the administration. We kept that funding in, fully funding the Chesapeake Bay program, because we need that program. Because, you know, New York and Pennsylvania aren't going to stop polluting the Chesapeake Bay unless there's a government arbiter, a federal government arbiter. That's an appropriate role for the EPA. That's why I fully supported it.
We'll now turn to Mr. Colvin to answer this question about the role of the EPA.
There are 435 congressional districts in our country, and exactly one, ours, is home to the Chesapeake Bay. There's a whole way of life here. It starts with the bay, it's its rivers, it's its tributaries, it's in the DNA of our livelihoods and our culture. We had a debate several days ago, and Congressman Harris, sir, you rushed to remind me that there are actually 7 congressional districts that border a touch on the Chesapeake Bay. I still think after 8 years, Dr. Harris doesn't get that the Chesapeake Bay is our crown jewel. It's what makes our culture and district unique. And it's not enough that you're just a member of the coal caucus, sir, even though we don't have coal. I just don't think you understand what makes the way of life here so unique. That way of life needs a champion in Washington. We used to have that in Congressman Wayne Gilchrist. Whether you agree with some of his votes or not, he went to Washington every day to fight for the way of life here. But it's not enough to be against something. We have to be for something. So here's what we're for. I want to get to 10 billion oysters by 2025. That will do fantastic things for our environment. It will do even better things for our local economies. We need a representative who understands and has the vision to understand that we need a representative who's going to fight for our crown jewel. And in our district, our crown jewel is the Chesapeake Bay. Thank you.
We'll now turn to Ms. Martin to respond to this question about the EPA.
Thank you. My belief is that government does hold the role of protecting its citizens. With that said, I do believe that the EPA does have a place within that role, however, not based on its current standards. Our congressional members delegate decisions to the EPA and neglect their duty in conducting cost-benefit analysis. The EPA does need to enforce certain regulations, and I'll give you an example. Our Conowingo Dam, while Maryland does have the autonomy to issue a certificate to Exxon, it is the responsibility of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to ensure that Exxon is doing its due diligence when ensuring that the pollution coming from that dam is hindered. We should not have congressional members agreeing that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission should issue a light operating license to this energy company. And I think that's where legislation, as far as the EPA is concerned, really needs to hold its ground. Thank you.
Thank you. For our third question, we're going to begin with Mr. Coleman. And this question concerns gun safety. What legislation, other than for mental health programs, would you support that would address the current level of gun violence in this country?
If we're going to talk about gun violence, I don't think every member of Congress needs to know, for example, the maximum effective range of an M4 rifle fired from the prone position. Dr. Harris, what's the max range?
Didn't think so. 80, doctor.
Didn't think so. I'm an Army Ranger. I could outshoot 90% of the people in this room. I could outshoot 100% of the people on this stage. My wife, who happens to be a Republican, served as a police officer. She could outshoot 95% of the people in this room and 100% of people on this stage. What's coming into focus after Parkland is that there are 2 groups of people in Congress. If you believe Congress could and should play a role in reducing gun violence, we have 2 groups, Group A and Group B. Group A is folks from both sides of the aisle who recognize that we have a gun violence issue in our country and want to do something to address it, have a common sense conversation. How do we address it? Maybe we don't know steps 1 through 50 of the roadmap, but we want to work on it because we recognize it's a major issue. And then you have Group B. Group B is in the back pocket of special interests. And like every issue, the special interests, if they want to continue getting their funding, are told to deflect, to divert, to defend, to do everything but allow us to have a common sense conversation. Dr. Harris lectured a 15-year-old at a recent event about her alleged misunderstanding of the Constitution. You can imagine what Group B's in. If you care about this issue, the choice in our district is pretty easy. Thank you.
And I would turn to Ms. Martin to respond to this question.
Members of Congress swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. Over a decade ago, in District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court upheld the decision that an individual's right to bear arms was constitutional. Legislation that chips at that right is unconstitutional. Now, do we have a problem in this country? Yes, but it's not the cause of an inanimate object. It's the cause of our family values and our social responsibilities when it comes to our children, our individuals that have mental health issues, and individuals that do feel in distress that using a gun to kill others is their only outlet. We need to wake up and understand that this is more than just picking up a handgun and shooting people. The mental capabilities of individuals, and we're not talking about mental health. Bullying is not new. Disgruntled employees are not new. People with mental health are not new. What's new is that we are failing as a society to address their problems, to prevent them from finding mass killing as their only outlet and their only source of, or their only resource of fixing what it is that is affecting them. I honestly believe that gun legislation does negate the constitutional rights of citizens of this country. And I honestly believe that we need to start turning ourselves around and instilling the family values that I grew up with. I had bullying in high school. I was bullied. Did I turn and say, oh, let me go get a gun? No, I turned to my mom and I said, Mom, this is how I'm feeling when I go to school every day. I turned to my grandmother and I said, Grandma, have you ever experienced this? Because we had the family values where I knew I could turn to the ones that I loved to help me in the situations that I had. I didn't turn to an inanimate object to kill others. So I do not think that there should be enhanced gun legislation. I think there are other avenues that we should focus on. Thank you.
Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much. Look, I think Ms. Martin got it right here. Thank goodness this actually isn't an Eastern Shore problem. We have good prosecutors, we have good law enforcement supported by the people, and we have homes and families where values are still taught and respected. I think she got it right on that. And my opponent's new to the shore. He might not realize this. He moved here from Washington, D.C. last year, and he already wants to ban the most widely owned rifle here on the shore. Already wants to ban it. That's why he got an F rating from the NRA. You didn't see that in his ad, though. That's why he's endorsed by New York City Mayor Bloomberg's radical gun control group, which thinks that we should restrict Second Amendment rights throughout the country because liberals can't control gun violence in our cities. I'm proud of my support of the Second Amendment. My parents came from countries where you couldn't own a firearm. We should never allow that to happen here. Now, Maryland already has among the strictest gun laws in the nation, but they have done little, if anything, to control gun violence in our largest city, Baltimore. Baltimore has 1/10 of the state's population, has 1/2 of the gun deaths. 7 murders in just one day last week, 45 murders in 31 days. It's so bad they have to take their 300 administrative officers, police officers, and put them on the street because they can't find someone to police in Baltimore, because after the Freddie Gray riots, the only thing that ended the Freddie Gray riots was Governor Hogan. They can't recruit police officers, and you can't blame them. The solution is not new gun laws. We should enforce the laws we already have on the books. The Baltimore Sun did a study, reported a study a year and a half ago. They said in 100 gun cases, in depth, the average sentence, only 40% were ever prosecuted. The average sentence was 6% of the sentence. And in fact, the average person who committed a gun violent crime, a felon committing a crime with a gun, mandatory sentence should be 5 years. They got 15% of the sentence. That's ridiculous. I said we should bring federal prosecutors in. We should bring U.S. attorneys in if necessary to stop the gun crime in Baltimore City.
Thank you. We'll now begin with some questions from you, the audience. This first question, and we'll begin with Ms. Martin, if you would. The first question is, how do we preserve freedom of the press when the current president is verbally abusive of the press?
Again, I will state that a congressional member's first duty is to uphold the Constitution. That includes the First Amendment. Now, while our current sitting president does have a habit of attacking the press, that's his constitutional right, as well as the constitutional right of every single journalist to write what they feel is best in their best interest and the best interest of their readers. I believe that legislation should just ultimately protect that right, and it should not hinder anyone from being able to speak their minds the way they choose. It is up to the American people on which side that they would like to focus on, whether they believe that the press are the enemy or whether they believe that the press are attacked too often. But other than that, individuals' First Amendment rights should be protected, and there shouldn't be any question about that.
We'll next turn to Mr. Harris.
Sure. Let's separate, because I think the question was an attack on the press or the freedom of the press. The president is not attacking freedom of the press. The president attacks media bias. Now, in this
Okay, I'm going to ask everyone to keep it down. We're here to hear them. If you disagree, you can vote.
I got to tell you, if you don't think the media is biased, you live in a parallel universe. But the bottom line is the president attacks media bias. He has the absolute right to attack a media bias. He does. Why? You make the media criticize you, but you can't criticize the media. That makes no sense whatsoever. It's plain and simple. I support all the groups that support all of our Bill of Rights. I don't care whether it's the ACLU supporting the First Amendment or the NRA supporting the Second Amendment. We need groups to support our rights and freedoms as America. My parents came from countries that didn't have freedom of the press. Really didn't have freedom of the press. They came from countries where they didn't have the right to bear an arm. I believe our Bill of Rights is very important, should be protected. I support every group that protects our Bill of Rights.
Okay, Mr. Colvin, the question concerned how preserving the freedom of the press.
Dr. Harris said it several months ago that he discounts and disavows everything in the mainstream press. That was in the heels of the Helsinki summit, and I found myself reacting very similarly to our own Republican Governor Hogan and the late Senator McCain, who stood up for the freedom of the press. I just want to address something earlier, where I'm from, Dr. Harris. I'm a fourth-generation Marylander. My son's a fifth-generation Marylander. My family came to this country as immigrants in 1899 through the port of Baltimore. Sir, you're born in Queens, New York. Your children were born in Queens, New York. You speak with a Queens, New York accent. You live in Cockeysville, Baltimore County, which is the most...
Candidates, please direct your comments to the audience if you would.
The most gerrymandered neighborhood and the most gerrymandered county and the most gerrymandered district in our state. Also, sir, I don't think you know where we are right now. We're on the Eastern Shore. We're both come-heres. Kate Libby, 7 generations. Mariah from my team, 13 generations. And I really don't think you know where you are politically. Right now, we're on the Eastern Shore, sir. We're in Talbot County. Do you know where you are right now? You're in Colvin country.
I'm going to ask all of you to help our candidates to follow these rules. I'd like each of you to direct your comments to the audience, please.
If the audience could do me one favor, if Dr. Harris keeps mentioning Baltimore City is not in our district, or somebody had a map for the incumbent of our district, that would be very appreciated.
Excuse me. Sorry, please continue.
Sure. Dr. Harris keeps mentioning Baltimore City. Baltimore City is not in our congressional district. If someone in the audience had a map for the incumbent, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, we've got another question from our audience. Let's be fair to them and hear the question and answer it. Please direct your comments to the audience. This response, our first respondent will be Mr. Harris. This question concerns broadband. What do you plan to do specifically to bring broadband to the many unserved regions of the 1st District?
Sure. You're right, Jesse. You grew up in Baltimore City. You know exactly where it is. And if I were a liberal, I'd be triggered by someone who said that somehow, because you're a 5th-generation Marylander, my parents immigrated to this country, and by the way, you don't get to choose where your parents live when you're born. I would be triggered by that comment if I were a liberal, but I'm going to let it pass. Now, let's talk about broadband. The USDA, and this is why it's actually important to have someone on the Appropriations Committee from a rural area. The fact of the matter is that, unlike Mr. Coleman, who grew up in cities, this is a rural area. And there are a lot of representatives from urban areas in Congress, but there aren't that many from rural areas. So when you get a representative sitting on the Appropriations Committee, sitting on the Agriculture Subcommittee, and you know that, for instance, the USDA is the prime source of funding for broadband to rural areas, then you got to say, well, what did your congressman do? Yeah. Well, your congressman supports broadband grants into the area, grants that have come from the USDA into this area. One of the reasons is because you have a congressman who sits on the Appropriations Committee, Agriculture Subcommittee. Fact of the matter is, that's why I read the Daily Times. That's why the Daily Times endorsed me yesterday. Because they say it's actually important to understand how Congress works and to have the experience and knowledge about the 1st Congressional District. Now, they interviewed both of us. They obviously thought this is a clear choice. Because when it comes to taking care of rural areas, there's no one with a better reputation than me in Congress.
Okay, Mr. Colvin, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to this question about broadband, if you would.
We have a massive connectivity issue in our congressional district, particularly in the Eastern Shore, particularly in our rural areas. It's an access issue, it's an education issue, it's an equality in rural areas. It's an access issue, it's an education issue, it's an equality issue, it's an entrepreneurship issue. It's all the above. One of our supporters lives in Talbot County. Her daughter is a freshman at Towson this year. They didn't have internet service at their home. They used to have to come to the Hampton Inn parking lot here to submit her homework when she was a senior in high school. But because she was 17, she procrastinated. And her mom would tell me we'd have to go to the parking lot at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. Dr. Harris has been on these committees for 8 years, and we still have massive connectivity problems. I don't know where the productivity is. This is why we need a new generation of leadership. We have a career politician problem. We need a new generation of leadership that's going to put country over party. In the mid-1930s, we decided that every farm, every cul-de-sac, every home was going to have electricity. That's why we got the Rural Electrification Act. We need to get there with broadband. I will tell you, we will never get there as long as we have members of Congress who are in the back pocket of special interests, because they're not going to allow them to vote that way. So if you care about this issue, and it affects everyone in this room, find members of Congress who are in the back pocket of special interests and vote them out.
Our next respondent will be Ms. Martin.
Thank you. With regards to broadband, I remember speaking with a farm owner, and I asked them, oh, do you have access to the internet? Can you look it up online? And their response was, no, we don't really have good internet service. It goes in and out. So we typically do everything, either by phone or we travel. What I believe is that any kind of services or goods that are provided to the American public need to stay out of the hands of the government, because the government is the one that's hindering cost-benefit effectiveness. They're hindering access with regulations and restrictions, and they're not ensuring that the barriers that are increasing the problems with individuals accessing these goods and services are gone. They're actually increasing these barriers. So with that regards, I believe that at a legislative level, we need to start funneling, processing, cost-benefit analysis to the state and local levels. Let the communities decide on what they want and what they need, and let them negotiate directly with the suppliers without the government middleman, their regulations, and their expensive costs.
Thank you. Our next question, for this next question, we will begin with Mr. Colvin as our first respondent. And the audience member writes, the federal budget deficit is rising and revenues are falling as a result of the last tax cut. What do you propose to do about this situation?
Dr. Harris talked about the booming economy we have nationally. I wish the incumbent had spent a little more time in the private sector, because I think if you looked at the fundamentals in our local economy in our district, you'll see that things aren't as rosy. Unemployment in our congressional district is twice the national average. We do have counties with higher unemployment than Dr. Harris's favorite place, Baltimore City. The median income in our congressional district is lagging well behind the state average. I would love to introduce you, Dr. Harris, to one of our Republican supporters in Carroll County. He owns a small business. It's a roofing company, and their product is steel. They're having a really tough year because of what's happening in international trade. We spent some time with some leaders in the ag community in Hartford County last night. They're having a really bad year. Some farms aren't going to actually campaign initially as a deficit hawk. It's the reason he defended his vote not to provide relief funding to the 4,000 homes and businesses that were destroyed by Hurricane Sandy. Ran as a deficit hawk, the deficit is soaring at levels we haven't seen in 6 years. It's going to saddle my son, who's 6 months old, and your kids and your grandkids. It is one of the top 3 gravest threats to our republic and our national security. So I got to ask, you were a deficit hawk, but now you're saying we have a deficit. Dr. Harris, what you can hear from leaders in Washington is now we're going to pay for it with cuts to Social Security and Medicare, which I know you call entitlements. They're not entitlements. So were you a deficit hawk then, or were you lying now? Which is it, sir?
Okay. We're going to move on to Ms. Martin again. We're going to keep our comments directed to the audience. Ms. Martin, if you would answer this question about the federal budget deficit and what you propose to do about it.
Thank you. Federal spending is out of control, considerably. Right now, according to statistics, there will be such a deficit that payments towards federal services within the government, not services to us, but services to governing members, aren't even going to be able to be covered. What I propose is a spending cap, legislation that incorporates a spending cap by our government to avoid a fiscal crisis like what we're heading in right now. I believe that the government should privatize federal infrastructure, allow the free market to take over so that they're not spending, and free states from federal regulations. I think that will also boost the economy. However, I can't say it enough, we need to get legislation passed to put a cap on how much our federal government is spending. Tax breaks are awesome. Every single American citizen deserves more of their hard-earned income in their pockets. But we need to stop the spending because we are headed for bankruptcy. Thank you.
We'll now turn to Mr. Harris to respond to the question about federal budget deficit.
Sure. As Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Colvin, there you go again. Really, the unemployment rate is twice as high in the 1st Congressional District, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Colvin got to fire his fact checker. Well, you go online, you go to the statistics published by the Maryland Department. There is only one county in the 1st District that has that is twice as high as the average. And that's Worcester County. And Mr. Colvin, if you weren't from Washington, D.C. and Baltimore City or from the 1st District, you'd know why Worcester County has twice as high unemployment on the official statistic, because it's a seasonal business area. It's had it for 50 years. There is not a single other county in the district that's twice as high. So fire your fact checker. Now let's talk about median income. Because median income is 10% lower. And rents are 25% lower. The cost of living, welcome to the 1st District in the Eastern Shore, Mr. Colvin. The cost of living actually here is lower than the Baltimore-Washington corridor. So actually you don't need to earn as much and you live better. Let's talk about spending. Let's talk about the hurricane. Let's talk about the Hurricane Sandy bill. Yeah.
I want to remind our audience to please hold their comments.
Let's talk about the reason I voted against the Hurricane Sandy bill. Because you know what? Washington is broken. They called it the Hurricane Sandy bill, but it had $1 million in it for a roadway in the Northern Mariana Islands. Now, the last time I looked at a map, the Northern Mariana Islands were nowhere near where where Hurricane Sandy struck. So I don't understand that. The unemployment, again, the unemployment is not as high. Look, I'm a member of the House Freedom Caucus. The problem is not revenue. We actually have record revenue last quarter. The problem is our spending is out of control, and we try to control it, but the Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer in the Senate, refuse to allow our spending bills to pass in the Senate.
Okay, and again, we're really trying to keep this focused on the audience. You guys have taken the time to be with us today. We want you to get answers to your questions. Next question, we will begin with Ms. Martin. Do you support the concept of term limits for members of Congress? If so, please describe the reason. If not, tell the audience why not.
I am 100% supporter of term limits. I've actually signed a pledge and I have placed it all over the place. I'm very proud of my stance. And the reason is because the constitutional drafters did their hardest to avoid any concept of tyranny in this country. And when we refuse to put limits on how long our governing members can stay in government, then we are moving away from what the constitutional founders and drafters' mission was. I think that as a congressional member, 2 term limits max. As state representative, governor, 2 term limits max. I don't think it should be more than that. There's no need. Times change. Generations come about. You need fresh new ideas to keep this country prospering. Thank you.
We'll next turn to Mr. Harris to respond to this question.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's why I co-sponsor term limit bills. Now I'll tell you where they go. When you co-sponsor term limit bill in the legislature, they go nowhere. Every state that has instituted term limits has only been able to do it through citizen referendum. Because let's face it, I can't find a whole bunch of people to co-sponsor my legislation, which actually was 6 terms in the House, 2 in the Senate, so it's 12 years. You can go back and forth. But that was the term limit legislation I sponsored. And the fact of the matter is, you can get by with term limits. They'll tell you, oh, you don't have term limits, you know, the experience is important. Well, let me tell you something. I mean, freshmen can be subcommittee chairman, because I was a subcommittee chairman as a freshman. Even though if you read it in the paper, you think I wasn't. Yes, they appointed me subcommittee of actually the Energy and Environment Subcommittee on the Science Committee because of my science background. Where I learned a lot about the energy industry, and in fact, coal actually is important in Maryland because it was one of our largest sources of energy, of actually our electricity. You know, if you drive an electric car, the energy isn't made out of thin air. It actually comes out of coal. So yeah, coal is important, and we actually do have coal mines in western Maryland. We had coal mines way over in the western part of Maryland, so it's important to the state of Maryland. So the bottom line is term limits are something we should do, but it's only going to occur if we have either a constitutional convention or you start really on the state-by-state level, so you build a groundswell. Because I will tell you, I was banging my head against the wall, because you go down to Washington, nobody wants term limits down there for obvious reasons. They do want to be career politicians. Now, Mr. Colvin says I wasn't in the private sector. Actually, I delivered anesthesia care in the private sector for about 30 years. I was in the private sector. And that's what's my ideal, is we should have a citizen legislature, where you go into the legislature, first of all, you have a career, you understand what's going on, you raise a family, you know how it is to raise kids, problems with school and problems with college. You go into the legislature, and then you go back home.
Mr. Coleman.
Dr. Harris, sir, you've been a politician for almost 2 decades. If you care so deeply about term limits, you could retire right now to go home. We could go home and watch the Ravens game.
Watch the Ravens, they kneel.
We're going to allow Mr. Gold to respond, please.
Gerrymandering, campaign finance reform are the 2 toxic elements in American politics today, and term limits have to be part of that conversation. We have a career politician problem in our country. In our district, we have gerrymandering meets campaign finance reform meets term limits all in one. I see this in very similar terms to my military service. I joined the military because I was 17 years old and the 9/11 attacks occurred, and it inspired me to teach English to Iraqi refugees in Syria, study Arabic, and ultimately join the Army. I served 6 years, served 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan, and then I left the service. I see this in very similar terms. If you care about this issue, in our district, it's a very simple choice. Just vote Dr. Harris out.
Okay, we're going to take the next question, and Mr. Harris, you'll have the first opportunity to respond. This question concerns immigration. How would you address enforcement of our immigration laws in a humane way? What changes to current immigration law would you advocate for?
Sure. I hope that the first thing we all agree is that this is a nation of the rule of law. And I don't know, that's why my parents came here, because a lot of other places in the world are not nations of the rule of law. The rule is enforced arbitrarily, sometimes not enforced at all, sometimes it depends on who you know. That's actually what's happened to our immigration laws in this country. We have immigration laws, and we all know 12, 20 million, nobody even knows how many people are here because the law was not enforced. And let me tell you something, it wasn't enforced by Democrats and it wasn't enforced by Republicans. Maybe for different reasons, but it wasn't. So the first thing we have to decide is that we're going to return to the rule of law. So do we need comprehensive immigration reform? Yeah, heck, we do. And by the way, we need temporary worker reform, and that's why I'm the leader on the H-2B issue. That's why Aubrey Lindsay's doing, it has an ad. Y'all see it, it's up on the air. The leader of the H-2B coalition in Maryland is endorsing me because she knows I'm a leader on this issue. But we got to go further than that. We have to say, what are we going to do now? So one of the issues was separation at the border, where you were separating parents from children. But, the president would merely enforce the law. I don't like the law, let's change the law. I'm all for that. But let's change the law. In the meanwhile, there were methods you could do, because what they were doing is they were taking, it is a crime to cross the border illegally. If you cross outside of a border crossing, it's a crime. It's a misdemeanor the first time, it's a felony the second time. The president was actually prosecuting the misdemeanors, because that way, the second time someone crosses, now it's a felony. The problem was the Department of Justice can't hold children, just like your jail here. You can't put a child in with a parent when they're being held for trial. So the answer is speedy trial. Get the trial going quickly so you don't have to separate the two, and then make sure you have a place where people seeking asylum can live with their families and rapidly adjudicate that asylum.
Mr. Coleman.
Your ad, sir, there's no S. It's not Lindsay. You could look it up. If we're ever going to have a bipartisan, comprehensive immigration reform, it's going to be a table with 4 legs. And Dr. Harris, I know we're both veterans. This is one of those moments where I wish you had a chance to serve in Iraq or Afghanistan or a war zone. And I say that because in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam, ideological leaders got people killed. It's a difference between ideological conservatism versus a pragmatic conservatism of a Governor Hogan. So if we're going to have a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform, the 4 legs are we're going to need security at our border. Army Rangers serve 4 combat tours in Afghanistan on the world's most dangerous border, tracking Taliban and Al-Qaeda across the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Number 2 is we can't have a reform that's going to punish American workers, and related number 3, it can't punish American companies who play within the system year in and year out. We also need to remember, I'm a family of immigrants, we're all family of immigrants. It's part of our values as a country. If we're ever going to have a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform, it depends on who's at that table. Because if you have ideologues at the table, we're never going to get anywhere. It's why we haven't had this reform in decades. We have an economic crisis right now here on the shore because the incumbent didn't pick up the phone ahead of time and ask those crab houses, do you need help with your H-2B visas? I'm going to call every one of those companies, whether they vote for me or not, because it's not in this immigration silo. It's an economics issue. It's a jobs issue. For every 1 job that doesn't happen there, 3 jobs are impacted locally. It's a way of life issue. I talked about the Chesapeake Bay needs a way of life, a defender. This is what I'm talking about. If you ever want comprehensive reform, count on these veterans running across the country, because we want to get to yes. We want to put country over party. Pragmatism, not ideology. Thank you.
We'll now turn to Ms. Martin to answer this question about immigration.
Thank you. We live in the greatest, and I cannot emphasize it's the greatest nation in the world. Our borders are protected. There's an issue going on in the South, Texas, Arizona. They have some problems. I will not negate that. But the heart of that problem is, why do people want to come here? Why is it so easy for them when they come to America? I'll tell you, means-tested welfare. In the access to means-tested welfare, and individuals will understand that if you come into this country, you're coming here to work, and you're coming here to work legally. That's number 1. You hinder their desire to come into a country where they can survive with underground. Because all they do is they go out and they get the resources, they go to social services, tell them that, you don't have your paperwork. Next thing you know, you're getting a couple of dollars in food stamps. That's a problem. Number 2, the illegal immigrants that are in this country now, rounding them up like cattle is not going to fix the problem. It comes from the legislative field. We need to ensure that these individuals that are contributing to our economy can still do so legally. How do you do that? You issue low-skilled worker green cards. You enable corporations to continue to hire those skilled workers that American employees do not choose to work in. And you ensure that there's no caps on the amount of workers that they can utilize. There are jobs all over this country, I will admit that. And the legal immigrants aren't taking them because those now hiring signs are still up. But we need to solve our illegal immigration problem with a pragmatic way that makes sense and doesn't just cause reason for scapegoats. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question from the audience concerns Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. There are those who would like to cut Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid to help pay for the budget deficit. What are your thoughts? And we'll start with Mr. Coleman.
We needed tax reform. Our small business owners needed tax reform. I talk a lot about ALICE families on the campaign trail. It's an acronym. Asset limited and income constrained employed. It's the family for whom if the carburetor breaks, next month it's a choice between rent and food or rent and prescription drugs because they can't pay both. 37% of working families in our district are ALICE families. They needed tax reform. That's not what we got. We got a bill written in the dead of night by special interests in the 11th hour. And if you look at who the benefits went to, and by the way, I think we need less politicians in Washington who feel it's part of their job to tell you how you should feel about your checkbook and your checking account at the end of every month. The benefits went to folks who were looking for a cut on their private jet, and billionaires and corporations. We needed tax reform. And now we're in a situation where we're going to have to pay for it. We have a looming deficit. It's one of the 3 largest threats to our republic, to our national security, to my 6-month-old, your kids, your grandkids. And now they're talking about cutting Social Security and Medicare. Dr. Harris talks about Social Security like it's an entitlement. I remember at 15, my first job, I came home and I told my dad, who is this FICA guy? What's going on with my paycheck? This is why we need a new generation of leadership who's going to put country over party. Thank you.
We'll now turn to Ms. Martin.
Social Security and Medicaid are paid for by American citizens. They're paid for every single pay period that you receive your income. You see Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare taken out of your check. That's your money. The government has no right to play with your money. However, as future generations continue to progress, I do believe that we need to take our retirement plans out of the hands of the federal government. Those that are retired, they continue to receive their benefits. Those that are still working, give them an option. Private retirement accounts, like IRAs, or do you want the government to play around with your retirement funds? If they choose, then the government should not be taking Social Security money out of your checks. If they choose to have the government play around with their retirement funds, so be it, but that's their choice. I think that Medicaid and CHIP should be converted to block grants. And I also think that means-tested welfare needs to end. Thank you.
We'll now turn to Mr. Harris.
Sure. Well, first of all, I feel for those ALICE families. They pay their taxes. They're not benefiting from a homestead tax break on a Washington, D.C. home that they don't deserve. I feel bad for them because all the people who are taking a homestead tax exemption they don't deserve means everybody else has to pay more. Now let's talk about Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. My record's clear. If you're in or near retirement, you can't touch Medicare and Social Security. My son's an accountant. He's 35. He knows what books look like. He knows the books aren't there for Social Security and Medicare for his generation. He figures he's got to save somewhere else because it ain't going to be there. So what we got to do is preserve Social Security and Medicare for people in and near retirement because that's a promise America made. That's a promise the government made. But for people in their 20s and 30s, we got to design a program that's going to be there. When my children get there in 35 or 30 years, that's a challenge. We all got to come together and agree that. And I understand the talking point, cutting Social Security, cutting Medicaid. Let's get past the talking points. We got to get together and solve that problem for the next generation. And I haven't heard any solution coming from Mr. Colvin on how we solve that problem. Let's talk about Medicaid, so let's turn it to Medicaid. As I've said, Medicaid is something, and I agree with Ms. Martin. What you got to do is you got to block grant it to the states. The bottom line is the states are the police of the Medicare system. They police the fraud, waste, and abuse. They qualify people. Get it back to the states, and then allow the states, if they cut the fraud and abuse, which is 10%, at least 10%, then they can redistribute that money and make sure that there's more money for the people who deserve it. But yeah, the people who don't deserve it shouldn't be getting it.
Okay. This next question, we will begin the responses with Ms. Martin. Do you support the Violence Against Women Act?
Yes. I don't know if I need to elaborate on that question, but absolutely. I support any act that protects an individual's rights to live the way that they see fit without having to worry about violence being, and with the inclusion of sexual assaults, with the inclusion of rape, with the inclusion of domestic violence, I absolutely support that.
Thank you. We'll go on to Mr. Harris.
Sure. I support the Violence Against Women Act as it was passed in the House last time. Now, I do believe in truth in advertising. And the fact of the matter is what happened is we reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, sent it over to the Senate, and it came back as violent against women and some men. Because if you're homosexual, you're included in the bill. That's not truth in advertising. And it belittles the problem women face from sexual harassment and sexual assault. We should deal with that problem. That's what the bill dealt with. And I'm sure Mr. Coleman would say, well, Mr. Harris voted against the bill. Check the record. I voted against the bill when it was about violence against women. When the Senate sent it back different, I did vote against it. You know what? Because I read the bills and I know what the changes are. And I think we should have truth in advertising in the name of the bill, and it wasn't truth in advertising in the name of that bill. Thank you.
Mr. Coleman.
Congressman, I don't think the women in this room need me to interpret your views on this issue. I would support the bill. You know, early on in one of my deployments to Afghanistan, a woman on my team, I found out, was sexually assaulted. And I didn't know what to do initially, but I figured it out, and I led an investigation. To make a long story short, we found the perpetrator, we identified him, got him fired off our compound within hours. And I bring it up because I think this job's about relationships, and the survivor in this story is now the godmother to our 6-month-old. And she's been a huge supporter personally, and a very close friend to my wife and I. After she saw the Supreme Court nomination hearings and process a couple of weeks ago and saw that Dr. Harris referred to Dr. Ford as a troubled woman with psychological issues, she said, Jesse, I want to write a letter. And she wrote a letter for our Facebook page and to our email program, and it was very simple. It was, Jesse believed in me, therefore I believe in Jesse. There's a reckoning coming. In politics and business, it's coming. And part of the solution is more women in office. I think also part of the solution is men who get it. And I aspire to be one of the men who gets it.
I'd ask you to please hold your applause. I have one job here, and that's to make sure that we pay heed to the rules. I know you want to hear from the candidates. Let's do that. For the next question, we will begin with Mr. Harris. Are you willing to reduce coal production to slow global warming?
You say reduce coal production?
That is what the question
Reduce coal
says.
production. Yeah, first of all, before that, I just want to say that a comment, because I was kind of attacked. My record as a veteran was attacked, and some people suggest that there's divisiveness going on. Ladies and gentlemen, I never thought that I would ever hear a fellow veteran criticize my 16 years in the Navy Reserve as a physician taking care of our wounded men and women in uniform. I never thought it would happen, and it happened at this table. Think long and hard about what happened here. Now, let me talk about coal. Let me talk about coal production. We can pretend that if the U.S. doesn't make any coal, that the world will stop burning coal. That would be a real pretend. Because India and China burn lots of coal. The only question is, where do they get it from? And if we don't produce it, Brazil will produce it. Or Korea, North Korea will produce it. Or Poland will produce it. There are plenty of countries in the world with coal. Now, we actually have metallurgical coal, which is a very high grade of coal, highly sought around the world. Why in the world should we cut our production of coal for export when other countries in the world aren't going to cut their production of coal for export? It's actually one of our natural resources. It actually stimulates our economy. It's one of the reasons why we have the best economic growth in a long time. Our unemployment rate, including in West Virginia and other places with coal mining, is down to a 50-year low. It's why we have 7.2 million jobs. It's all part of it. Now, should we cut down the number of coal plants that burn coal in the United States? Sure, but to pretend that the world will cut down on it and they can go buy coal from somewhere else, not from America, and we have high-quality, high-grade coal, that's crazy. That's economic craziness.
We'll now turn to Mr. Colvin for a response.
This is what happens when you ask a member of Congress who's in the back pocket of special interest about the topic at hand. They are given large amounts of corporate and special interest funding not to talk about these issues. We have the Chesapeake Bay in our district. It's our crown jewel of our culture. It's what makes us unique. We don't have any coal. You know, the next $1 billion, the short answer is yes, by the way. The next $1 billion idea that could come from our district, especially from the Eastern Shore, is going to come from one of the 3 Fs: farm, food, or fish. And panels and turbines are going to be part of that. My son is 6 months old. When you and I drive down the street, we see electrical transmission lines, but we don't really see them because for us they're receded in the back of our mind's eye. My son is going to grow up in a world where he sees turbines and panels in a very similar way. Right now, the community college in Montgomery County is the only community college in our state with a trades program in solar, one of the fastest growing industries in the state and the country. There's no reason we couldn't have that here at Chesapeake, or Warwick, or Cecil College, or Harper Community College. By the way, sir, Dr. Harris, we were not very sensitive in the Army Rangers, and I'm sorry that hurt your feelings.
I'm going to ask the next question. This question now goes to Ms. Martin. Ms. Martin, are you willing to reduce coal production to slow global warming?
I am a strong believer in the free market. I don't believe that it's government's responsibility to interfere with market practices. I believe that the government's responsibility to protect citizens for those that they want to harm them. But there are so many clean energy innovations that are arising right now in this country that I don't think it's a need for legislation to impact the coal industry. I think the free market is just going to simply weed it out. So therefore, I don't think that legislation is required where we need to step in and say, well, hey, let's stop coal production because of a global crisis that may be arising with our climate. The market is going to do that already. I mean, there are so many industries that have already implemented clean energy processing that it's not something that there are so many greater things that the government needs to focus on than playing around with our economy and our markets. And coal is one of them. Thank you.
Okay, our next question, for our next question, we'll begin with Mr. Colvin. What are your plans for improving the health of the Chesapeake Bay?
I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I want to get to 10 billion oysters by 2025. That's an ambitious number. It's going to force us, it's ambitious because we'll have to address the situation in the Conowingo Dam. We'll have to deal with chicken litter down on the lower shore. It's going to do great things for our environment. One idea that I reject is that in our district, somehow an investment in the environment and what's good for our economy are somehow mutually exclusive. They're not. In our district, they're hand in glove. If we invest in the health of our environment, if we invest in the health of Chesapeake Bay, its rivers, and its tributaries, it will do great things for our local economies. There could be trades programs for the community colleges in our district. To say it again, there's a way of life here that is unique. We have unique American traditions that are unlike any other place in the country. And the #1 defender of that way of life in Congress in Washington should be the representative from Maryland's 1st. and I aspire to be that leader for you.
We'll next turn to Ms. Martin.
I will just reflect on my statement when we were discussing the EPA. While I don't I'm not with the idea of stepping on the toes of the state's ability to make its own choices when it comes to enabling energy companies. I do believe that it is the responsibility of the Federal Regulatory Commission to ensure that those companies are not damaging the environment, the citizens in which they are practicing.
Mr. Harris.
Sure. Well, I am the co-chair of the Chesapeake Bay Caucus. I mean, I'm kind of like lost in the discussion, but actually I'm one of the leaders on the Chesapeake Bay. And that's, as I said, the Chesapeake Bay program was defunded in the Trump budget proposal to Congress. In his first year, it was zeroed out. In the second year, it was greatly cut. I fought both those cuts. I signed letters to the administration and to the committee to fight those cuts. I voted for the restoration of the committee, and you know what? Working with across the aisle, with our Democratic senators and with Democrats in the House, we restored that funding, and it's fully funded. That's the most important thing your representative in Washington can do. And we can talk about billions of oysters and things like that. The most important thing is keep that because you know how the Conowingo Dam got all that stuff behind it? From New York and Pennsylvania. And without the Chesapeake Bay program funded, the EPA is unable to enforce things. Now, let's talk about the Conowingo Dam a little. There's actually, Mr. Coleman criticized me for taking money from Exelon, and somehow I couldn't be an arbiter on the Conowingo Dam. Mr. Coleman, you took money from Mr. Rufusberg, Mr. Hoyer. Both of them took money from Exelon more than I did. You know, it's what you've done about an issue. It's my meetings with the Army Corps of Engineers about the problem, making sure that the U.S. Geological Survey and the Fish and Wildlife Service are doing a study that they've got to do to see whether it's how economically you can solve the Conowingo problem. To say that, well, Exelon's going to clean it up is just not true. Exelon, the cost is so high that Exelon will just walk away from the power project. If they have to, they'll walk away. So the key is actually making sure everybody's at the table and not outright saying, well, you can't talk to Exelon because, you know, they're the bad guys on Conowingo. No, New York and Pennsylvania are the bad guys on Conowingo. And that's why that EPA Chesapeake Bay program is so important. That's why I support it.
Okay, for the next question, we'll start with Ms. Martin. This will probably be our last question so we can save time for our candidates to make closing remarks. I regret we couldn't get to all audience questions. I appreciate everyone's submissions. And now to Ms. Martin, this question concerns housing. Affordable housing is problematic in most counties. Is there something that you could do in your role to address this? The question is about housing.
Housing,
And affordable housing.
affordable housing, something to do at the federal level?
Right.
Okay. Housing initiatives, govern housing, as they're called in urban cities. I must say they're not something where I feel that the federal government should even touch. Housing initiatives should be implemented at the local and state levels, and I'll explain to you why. Each environment is unique, and by implementing a universal standard that doesn't actually meet the needs of those particular communities, we're making it worse for them. What's required on the Eastern Shore may not be required in New York City. What's required on the Eastern Shore may not be required in Chicago. So why are we looking at a centralized solution to the problem? It should be something that's delegated to the states and the local level so they can address what their communities need and attach those needs based onto their unique qualities. Thank you.
I'll now turn to Mr. Harris.
Sure. Look, affordable housing is a problem, and it's a problem in rural areas as well, and that's why the USDA has special programs for rural areas that allow for affordable housing. That's why I'm proud to serve on the Agriculture Subcommittee of Appropriations, because we actually appropriate into the USDA program. I make sure that those programs are adequately funded to make sure that we have affordable housing in rural areas. Now, there are only 12 members out of 435 in the House who sit on that Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee. I was honored to be put on that subcommittee. I asked for it because, as I said, the problem is we have a lot of representatives from urban areas who I think they think, you know, chickens are raised somewhere in the back room of the Safeway or something. I don't know. They don't understand rural areas. They don't understand the problems of rural areas. You got to have a representative who understands it. Someone who's actually lived in this district for 30 years, worked in this district right down the street, knows every bit. That's why they read the Daily Times endorsement. They understand the importance. This is serious. This is not just talking points. This is serious. We have to protect our rural legacy, and the USDA is important. And that's why that's my #1 choice. When I ask for what subcommittee I want to be on the Agriculture Subcommittee, because it's so important to this area. Now, that being said, there's the issue of Section 8 housing. And I feel this way, the same way I feel with other programs. If you have an able-bodied adult, not someone disabled, not elderly, not a pregnant woman, not someone taking care of young children, able-bodied adult living in Section 8 housing, you better ask them, train for a job, look for a job, get a job. Because all of us have to pay for that. And I think it's not good for that person, it's not good for the taxpayer paying for that person, to not ask that able-bodied person to get a job, especially in the economy we have now. Thank you.
And we'll turn to Mr. Colvin.
The question on Conowingo, Dr. Harris mentioned that he takes money from the corporate PAC, from Exelon, the company, and I've taken money from members of the Maryland delegation. Does that not make any sense to anyone else in this room?
Please don't respond.
Dr. Harris talks a lot about serving as a representative, and there's clearly a huge focus on what committee you're on and what subcommittee you're on. That's a huge part of his talking points. What he's not telling you is that he wrote three bills last year, none of which actually made it into law. So if we're talking a simple answer to a simple question, it's when we talk about housing policy, that's fighting for Alice families. And also, we haven't mentioned it yet, but it's going to require the person in the seat to bring a very rigorous oversight to Dr. Carson at that agency. But as we talk about coal and Conowingo and the opioids epidemic, thinking about the fact that we have fatalities that are 50% higher than the national average in our congressional district from the opioids epidemic, and we're here at where Purple Month began, so I just want to mention this before we close. It makes me extremely proud of our decision not to take any money from corporate PACs. Because as I sit here and I'm listening and participating here, there are questions that you can answer with integrity, forcefully, simply, on issues. And when you're funded by special interests, and those votes are bought and paid for, you can't answer them directly and forcefully and truthfully. You know, Dr. Harris voted on about 24 bills last year to go after the opioids epidemic. That's great on the surface, but if you look underneath, not one of them brought any sort of accountability to the pharmaceutical industry. If you want to make the connection between campaign finance reform and the opioids epidemic, that's what it looks like.
Okay, we're going to take time now to hear and permit our candidates to make some closing statements. We're going to go in the reverse order from our introductory statements. So we'll begin with Mr. Harris, then go to Ms. Martin, and then Mr. Colvin. So Mr. Harris.
Sure, thank you very much, and thank the League of Women Voters again. Look, Mr. Colvin takes money from union PACs. Now, last time I looked, union PACs actually are a special interest, and by the way, Mr. Colvin, there isn't a whole lot of union activity in the 1st Congressional District. It's not the same as Washington, D.C., not the same as Baltimore City. There's actually not many unions out here. They are special interests. I think that's why Mr. Colvin refuses to join me in telling our veterans they should have a choice where they receive their health care. I challenged him 3 days ago in Cecil County to join me. We can go out and have a press conference about it right now. Let's go ahead and give our veterans a choice. They earned it. I'm not a newcomer for the 1st District. I'll remind you again, lived in it for over 30 years. Didn't just move into it last year. My homestead exemption is actually on my house in the district, not on the last one that I lived in Washington, D.C. I served for 16 years, and I'm going to repeat it. I never thought I'd hear the day a fellow veteran would say that somehow my service was unequal to someone else's service. That is stunning to me. It's stunning. Look, I know it's rare. I know it's rare for someone running for office to actually deliver on their promises, but the fact of the matter is I ran 8 years ago saying we would have more jobs and lower taxes, and we'd defend our freedoms and liberties. 7.2 million jobs now. Job openings. Unemployment rate, historic low, 49-year low unemployment rate. $2,500 back in the pockets of our hard-working families. You know, those Alice families got more money in their pocket now because of our tax bill. I'm proud of it. I'm proud I'm a friend of the farmer. The American Farm Bureau Federation understands that I understand the district. I'm proud that I got the endorsement of the National Federation of Independent Businesses. These are the backbone of our economy. You know, you've heard a lot. You've heard a lot about this and a lot of talking points. Go online. Go online. You'll realize that this is not a talking points election. This is an election about the future of the 1st Congressional District. I ask for your vote on November 6th.
Ms. Martin.
Thank you. You know, as I reflect on some of the questions that came from the audience and some of the topics that we discussed here today, I strongly remember the reason why I decided to run. When you look at circumstances like the opioid epidemic, my mother, for 25 years, has been on prescribed opioid medications for her back pain, and her brain and body is deteriorating. I think of things like that. When I think of how our family values are deteriorating due to government intervention when it comes to social assistance programs, I think of things like that. When I think about the barriers of individuals who need medical options and there are state interventions that are preventing them from accessing it, I think about things like that. When I think about our country's dependency on fossil fuels from the Middle East that is increasing our military spending and our deficit, I think about things like that. I want change. I want change starting at the federal level. I want to put the power of government back into the hands of citizens, because we should not have to endure the multiple circumstances that are arising from government intervention. I ask you, if you want the same changes that I am looking for, if you deal with the same problems that so many of us across this nation, in this district, deal with, I ask you to go on November 6th and say enough is enough. No more partisan bickering. No more hypocrisy and bureaucracy coming from the individuals that gave an oath to uphold our constitutional rights, uphold our Constitution, and they continue to fail to do that for their special interests. If you want change, I beg you on November 6th to let them know that.
Mr. Coleman, your closing statement.
There are actually thousands of jobs that are in our district related to organized labor, and one of the unions we're supported by is UA. It's the plumbers and the pipe fitters and steamers. They're actually they endorsed the governor, Dr. Harris, so I don't know what he's doing right that you're not. And I'll say it again, Army Rangers, we are not known for sensitivity, and I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, sir. Thank you very much, Ms. Ortiz. Thank you to the League. Thank you to my wife for hosting this event. I'm a 4th generation Marylander. My son's a 5th generation Marylander. 9/11 inspired me to join the Army, where I served in Korea. I served 4 combat tours to Afghanistan as an Army Ranger. I hear the call to serve again. As I've traveled around our district, doing 30,000 miles in my truck, I hear a common refrain, that folks are tired of having a representative in Washington who's woefully out of touch. We need a new generation of leadership in Washington to tackle our most difficult challenges. Economic growth that is sustained but also shared. Guaranteeing coverage to those with pre-existing conditions. And making healthcare more affordable while maintaining its quality and accessibility, because in rural America, and that's us, that's key. And investing in the Chesapeake Bay and the way of life here. I've discovered campaigning is a lot like deploying to Afghanistan. And I thought a lot about Afghanistan and my 4 deployments there on the campaign. My first deployment, I went to 7 memorial services. You grew up really fast. And my first deployment, my boss said, Jesse, I fired the last 4 guys in your job, and I don't care if you have enough energy, time, resources, you will get the job done, you will get results, or I'll fire you. You can bet your bottom dollar I got that job done, and if we put country over party and show up and listen, we can get it done here too. Thank you.
Please thank our candidates, Mr. Coleman, Mr. Horton, and Mr. Harris. Thank you.